Alright, we are back. Love in the Time of Cholera, Chapter 3, Part 2. My last video got a little interrupted, so I'm gonna have to back up a little bit, but I think it stopped at a pretty decent spot. Sorry if you can hear a little bit of rain, but we will start near the bottom of page 121. His mother and sisters were having café con leche and crullers for supper at the formal table in the large dining room when they saw him appear in the door, his face haggard and his entire being dishonored by the whorish perfume of the crows. The largest bell of the adjacent Catholic cathedral sounded in the immense empty space of the house. His mother asked him in alarm where in the world he had been, for they had looked everywhere for him so that he could attend General Ignacio Maria, the last grandson of the Marquis de Harias de la Vera, who had been struck down that afternoon by a cerebral hemorrhage. It was for him that the bells were tolling. Dr. Juvenal Urbino listened to his mother without hearing her as he clutched the doorframe, and then he gave a half-turn, trying to reach his bedroom, but he fell flat on his face, and in an explosion of star-anise vomit. "Mother of God!" shouted his mother. "Something very strange must have happened for you to show up in your own house in this state." The strangest thing, however, had not yet occurred. Taking advantage of the visit of the famous pianist Romeo Lucic, who played a cycle of Mozart sonatas, as soon as the city had recovered from mourning the death of General Ignacio Maria, Dr. Juvenal Urbino had the piano from the music school placed in a mule-drawn wagon and brought a historic-making serenade to Fermina Daza. She was awakened by the first measures, and she did not have to look out the grating on the balcony to know who was the sponsor of that uncommon tribute. The only thing she regretted was not having the courage of other harassed maidens who emptied their chamber pots on the heads of unwanted suitors. Lorenzo Daza, on the other hand, dressed without delay as the serenade was playing, and when it was over he had Dr. Juvenal Urbino and the pianist, still wearing their formal concert clothes, come into the visitors' parlor, where he thanked them for the serenade with a glass of good brandy. Fermina Daza soon realized that her father was trying to soften her heart. The day after her serenade, he said to her in a casual manner, "Imagine how your mother would feel if she knew you were being courted by an Urbino de la Cal." Her dry response was, she would turn over in her grave. The friends who painted with her told her that Lorenzo Daza had been invited to lunch at the social club by Dr. Juvenal Urbino, who had received a severe reprimand for breaking club rules. It was only then that she learned that her father had applied for membership in the social club on several occasions, and that each time he had been rejected with such a large number of blackballs that another attempt was not possible. But Lorenzo Daza had an infinite capacity for assimilating humiliations, and he continued his ingenious strategies for arranging casual encounters with Juvenal Urbino, not realizing that it was Juvenal Urbino who went out of his way to let himself be encountered. At times, they spent hours chatting in the office while the house seemed suspended at the edge of time, because Fermina Daza would not permit anything to run its normal course until he left. The parish café was a good intermediate haven. It was there that Lorenzo Daza gave Juvenal Urbino his first lessons in chess, and he was such a diligent pupil that chess became an incurable addiction that tormented him until the day of his death. One night, a short while after the serenade, by solo piano Lorenzo Daza discovered a letter, its envelope sealed with wax, in the entryway to his house. It was addressed to his daughter, and the monogram J.U.C. was imprinted on the seal. He slipped it under the door, and he passed Fermina's bedroom, and she never understood how it had come there, since it was inconceivable to her that her father had changed so much that he would bring her a letter from a suitor. She left it on the night table, for the truth was she did not know what to do with it, and there it stayed, unopened, for several days, until one rainy afternoon when Fermina Daza dreamed that Juvenal Urbino had returned to the house to give her the tongue depressor he had used to examine her throat. In the dream, the tongue depressor was made not of aluminum, but of a delicious metal that she had tasted with pleasure in other dreams, so that it broke in 2 unequal pieces and gave him the smaller one. When she awoke, she opened the letter. It was brief and proper, and all that Juvenal Urbino asked was permission to request her father's permission to visit her. She was impressed by its simplicity and seriousness, and the rage she had cultivated with so much love for so many days faded away on the spot. She kept the letter in the bottom of her trunk, but she remembered that she had also kept Florentino Ariza's perfumed letters there, and she took it out of the chest to find another place for it, shaken by a rush of shame. Then it seemed that the most decent thing was to do was to pretend she had not received it, and she burned it in the lamp, watching how the drops of wax exploded into blue bubbles above the flame. She sighed, "Poor man," and then she realized that it was the second time she had said those words in a little more than a year, and for a moment she thought about Florentino Ariza, and even she was surprised at how removed he was from her life. Poor man. Poor man. 3 more letters arrived with the last rains in October, the first of them accompanied by a little box of violet pastils from Flavigny Abbey. 2 had been delivered at the door by Dr. Juvenal Urbino's coachman, and the doctor had greeted Galla Placidia from the carriage window, first so that there would be no doubt that the letters were his, and second so that no one could tell him that they could not have been received. Moreover, both of them were sealed with his monogram in wax, and written in the cryptic scrawl that Fermina Daza already recognized as a physician's handwriting. Both of them said in substance what had been said in the first, and were conceived in the same submissive spirit, but underneath their propriety one could begin to detect an impatience that was never evident in the parsimonious letters of Florentino Ariza. Fermina Daza read them as soon as they were delivered, 2 weeks apart, and without knowing why, she changed her mind as she was about to throw them into the fire, but she never thought of answering them. The 3rd letter in October had been slipped under the street door and was in every way different from the previous ones. The handwriting was so childish that there was no doubt it had been scrawled with the left hand, but Fermina Daza did not realize that until the text proved to be a poisoned pen letter, whoever had written it took for granted that Fermina Daza had bewitched Dr. Juvenal Urbino with her love potions, and from that supposition, sinister conclusions had been drawn. It ended with a threat. If Fermina Daza did not renounce her efforts to move up in the world by means of the most desirable man in the city, she would be exposed to public disgrace. She felt herself the victim of a grave injustice, but her reaction was not vindictive. On the contrary, she would have liked to discover who the author of the anonymous letter was in order to convince him of his error with all the pertinent explanations, for she felt certain that never, for any reason, would she respond to the wooing of Juvenal Urbino. In the days that followed, she received 2 more unsigned letters, as perfidious as the first, but none of the 3 seemed to be written by the same person. Either she was the victim of a plot, or the false version of her secret love affair had gone further than anyone could imagine. She was disturbed by the idea that it was all the result of a simple indiscretion on the part of Juvenal Urbino. It occurred to her that perhaps he was different from his worthy appearance, that perhaps he talked too much when he was making house calls and boasted of imaginary conquest, as did so many other men of his class. She thought about writing him a letter to reproach him for the insults to her honor, but then she decided against the idea because that might be just what he wanted. She tried to learn more from the friends who painted with her in the sewing room, but they had heard only benign comments concerning the serenade by solo piano. She felt furious, impotent, humiliated. In contrast to her initial feeling that she wanted to meet with her invisible enemy in order to convince him of his errors, now she only wanted to cut him to ribbons with the pruning shears. She spent sleepless nights analyzing details and phrases in the anonymous letters in the hopes of finding some shred of comfort. It was a vain hope. Fermina Daza was, by nature, alien to the inner world of the Urbino della Cal family, and she had weapons for defending herself from their good actions, but not from their evil ones. This conviction became even more bitter after the fear caused by the black doll that was sent to her without any letter, but whose origin seemed easy to imagine. Only Dr. Juvenal Urbino could have sent it, and it had been bought in Martinique, according to the original tag, and it was dressed in an exquisite gown, its hair rippled with gold threads, and it closed its eyes when it was laid down. It seemed so charming to Fermina Daza that she overcame her scruples and laid it on her pillow during the day and grew accustomed to sleeping with it at night. After a time, however, she discovered, when she awoke from an exhausting dream, that the doll was growing. The original exquisite dress she had arrived in was up to her thighs, and her shoes had burst from the pressure of her feet. Fermina Daza had heard of African spells, but none as frightening as this. On the other hand, she could not imagine that a man like Juvenal Urbino would be capable of such an atrocity. She was right. The doll had been brought not by his coachman, but by an itinerant shipmonger who no one knew. Trying to solve the enigma, Fermina Daza thought for a moment of Florentino Ariza, whose depressed condition caused her dismay, but life convinced her of her error. The mystery was never clarified, and just thinking about it made her shudder with fear long after she was married and had children and thought herself as Destiny's darling, the happiest woman in the world. Dr. Urbino's last resort was the meditation of Sister Franca de la Luz, superior of the Academy of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin, who could not deny the request of a family that had supported her community since its establishment in the Americas. She appeared one morning at 9 o'clock in the company of a novice, and for half an hour the two of them had to amuse themselves with the bird cages while Fermina Daza finished her bath. She was a masculine German with a metallic accent and an imperious gaze that had no relationship to her puerile passions. Fermina Daza hated her and everything that had to do with her more than anything in this world, and the mere memory of her false piety made scorpions crawl in her belly. Just the sight of her from the bathroom was enough to revive the torture of school, the unbearable boredom of daily mass, the terror of examinations, the servile diligence of the novices, all of that life distorted by the prism of spiritual poverty. Sister Franca de la Luz, on the other hand, greeted her with a joy that seemed sincere. She was surprised at how much she had grown and matured, and she praised the good judgment with which she had managed the house, the good taste evident in the patio, the brazier filled with orange blossoms. She ordered the novice to wait for her without getting too close to the crows, who in a careless moment might peck out her eyes, and she looked for a private spot where she could sit down and talk alone with Fermina, who invited her to the drawing room. Middle of 126. It was a brief and bitter visit. Sister Franca de la Luz, wasting no time on formalities, offered honorable reinstatement to Fermina Daza. The reason for her expulsion would be erased not only from the records, but also from the memory of the community, and this would allow her to finish her studies and receive her baccalaureate degree. Fermina Daza was perplexed and wanted to know why. Is it the request of someone who deserves everything he desires and whose only wish it is to make you happy? It is, said the nun. Do you know who that is? Then she understood. She asked herself with what authority a woman who had made her life miserable because of an innocent letter served as the emissary of love, but she did not dare to speak of it. Instead, she said, yes, she knew that man, and by the same token, she also knew that he had no right to interfere in her life. All he asks is that you allow him to speak with you for 5 minutes, said the nun. I am certain your father will agree. Fermina Daza's anger grew more intense at the idea that her father was an accessory to the visit. We saw each other twice when I was sick, she said. Now there is no reason for us to see each other again. For any woman with a shred of sense, that man is a gift from divine providence, said the nun. She continued to speak of his virtues, of his devotion, of his dedication to serving those in pain. As she spoke, she pulled from her sleeve a gold rosary with Christ carved in marble and dangled it in front of Fermina Daza's eyes. It was a family heirloom, more than 100 years old, carved by a goldsmith from Siena and blessed by Clement IV. It is yours, she said. Fermina Daza felt the blood pounding through her veins, and then she dared. I do not understand how you can lend yourself to this, she said, if you think that love is a sin. Sister Franca de la Luz pretended not to notice the remark, but her eyelids flamed. She continued to dangle the rosary in front of Fermina Daza's eyes. "It would be better for you to come to an understanding with me," she said, "because after me comes His Grace the Archbishop, and it is a different story with him." "Let him come," said Fermina Daza. Sister Franca de la Luz tucked the gold rosary into her sleeve. Then from the other she took a well-used handkerchief, squeezed it into a ball, and held it tight in a fist, looking at Fermina Daza from a great distance and with a smile of commiseration. "My poor child," she sighed. "You are still thinking about that man." Fermina Daza chewed on the impertinence as she looked at the nun without blinking, looked her straight in the eye without speaking, chewing in silence until she saw the infinite satisfaction that those masculine eyes had filled with tears. Sister Franca de la Luz dried them with the ball of the handkerchief and stood up. "Your father is right when he says that you are a mule," she said. The Archbishop did not come, so the siege might have ended that day if Hildebranda Santos had not arrived to spend Christmas with her cousin, and life changed for the both of them. They met her on the schooner from Riohacha at 5 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by a crowd of passengers half dead from seasickness, but she walked off the boat radiant, very much a woman, and excited after the bad night at sea. She arrived with crates of live turkeys and all the fruits of her fertile lands, so that no one would lack for food during her visit. Lysimaco Sanchez, her father, sent a message asking if they needed musicians for their holiday parties, because he had the best at his disposal, and he promised to send a load of fireworks later on. He also noticed that he could not come for his daughter before March, so there was plenty of time for them to enjoy life. The two cousins began at once. From the first afternoon, they bathed together naked, the two of them making their reciprocal ablutions with water from the cistern. They soaped each other, they removed each other's knits, they compared their buttocks, their quiet breasts, each looking at herself in the other's mirror, to judge with what cruelty time had treated them since the last occasion when they had seen each other undressed. Hildebranda was large and solid, with golden skin, but all the hair on her body was like a mulatta's, as short and curly as steel wool. Fermina Daza, on the other hand, had a pale nakedness, with long lines, serene skin, and straight hair. Galla Placidia had two identical beds placed in the bedroom, but at times they lay together in one and talked in the dark until dawn. They smoked long, thin highwayman's cigarettes that Hildebranda had hidden in the lining of her trunk, and afterward they had to burn Armenian paper to purify the rank smell they left behind in the bedroom. Fermina Daza had smoked for the first time in Valledupar and had continued in Fonseca and Riohacha, where as many as 10 cousins would lock themselves in a room to talk about men and to smoke. She learned to smoke backward, with the lit end in her mouth, the way men smoked at night during the wars, so that the glow of their cigarettes would not betray them. But she had never smoked alone. With Hildebranda in her house, she smoked every night before going to sleep, and it was then that she acquired the habit, although she always hid it, even from her husband and her children, not only because it was thought improper for a woman to smoke in public, because she associated it, the pleasure with secrecy. Hildebranda's trip had also been imposed by her parents in an effort to put distance between her and her impossible love, although they wanted her to think that it was to help Fermina decide on a good match. Hildebranda had accepted, hoping to mock forgetfulness as her cousin had done before her, and she arranged with the telegraph operator in Fonseca to send her messages with the greatest prudence, and that is why her disillusion was so bitter that she learned that Fermina Daza had rejected Florentino Ariza. Moreover, Hildebranda had a universal conception of love, and she believed that whatever happened to one love affected all other loves throughout the world. Still, she did not renounce her plan. With an audacity that caused a crisis of dismay in Fermina Daza, she went to the telegraph office alone, intending to win the favor of Florentino Ariza. She would not have recognized him, for there was nothing about him that corresponded to the image she had formed from Fermina Daza. At first glance, it seemed impossible that her cousin could have been on the verge of madness because of that almost invisible clerk with his air of a whipped dog, whose clothing worthy of a rabbi in disgrace, and whose solemn manner could not perturb anyone's heart. But she soon repented of her first impression, for Florentino Ariza placed himself at her unconditional service without knowing who she was. He never found out. No one could have understood her as he did, so that he did not ask for identification or even for her address. His solution was very simple. She would pass by the telegraph office on Wednesday afternoons so that he could place her lover's answers in her hand and nothing more. And yet, when he read the written message that Hildebrand brought him, he asked if he would accept a suggestion. He asked if she would accept his suggestion, and she agreed. Florentino Ariza first made some corrections between the lines, erased them, rewrote them, had no more room, and at last tore the page up and wrote a completely new message that she thought very touching. When she left the telegraph office, Hildebrand was on the verge of tears. "He is ugly and sad," she said to Fermina Daza, "but he is all love." Oh, so good. What most struck Hildebrand was her cousin's solitude. She seemed, she told her, an old maid of 20. Accustomed to large scattered families and houses where no one was certain how many people were living or eating at any time, Hildebrand could imagine a girl her age reduced to the cloister of a private life. That was true. From the time she woke at 6 in the morning until she turned up the light in the bedroom, Fermina Daza devoted herself to killing time. Life was imposed on her from outside. First, at the final rooster crow, the milkman woke her with his rapping on the door knocker. Then came the knock of the fishwife with her box of red snappers, dying on the bed of algae, the sumptuous fruit sellers with vegetables from Maria La Baja and fruit from San Jacinto. And then for the rest of the day, everyone knocked at the door. Beggars, girls with lottery tickets, the sisters of charity, the knife grinder with the gossip, the man who brought bottles, the man who bought old gold, the man who bought newspapers, the fake gypsies who offered to read one's destiny in cards in the lines of one's palm, in coffee grounds, in the water in wash basins. Carla Placidia spent the week opening and closing the door to say no, another day or shouting from the balcony in a foul humor to stop bothering us. Damn it, we already bought everything we need. She had replaced Aunt Escolastica. I hadn't said her name in a while. She had replaced Aunt Escolastica with so much fervor and so much grace that Fermina confused them to the point of loving her. She had the obsessions of a slave. Whenever she had free time, she would go to the workroom to iron the linens. She kept them perfect. She kept them in cupboards with lavender, and she ironed and folded not only what she had just washed, but also what might have lost its brightness through disuse. With the same care, she continued to maintain the wardrobe of Fermina Sanchez, Fermina's mother, who had died 14 years before. But Fermina Daza was the only one who made the decisions. Was the one who made the decisions. She ordered what they would eat, what they would buy, what had to be done in every circumstance, and in that way she determined the life in a house where in reality nothing had to be determined. When she finished washing the cages and feeding the birds and making certain that the flowers wanted for nothing, she was at a loss. Often, after she was expelled from school, she would fall asleep at siesta and not wake up until the next day. The painting classes were only a more amusing way to kill time. Her relationship with her father had lacked affection since the expulsion of Aunt Escolastica, although they had found the way to live together without bothering each other. When she awoke, she had already gone to his business. He rarely missed the ritual of lunch, although he almost never ate, for the aperitifs, the Galatian appetizers at the parish cafe satisfied him. He did not eat supper either. They left his meal on the table, everything on one plate covered by another, although they knew that he would not eat it until the next day when it was reheated for his breakfast. Once a week, he gave his daughter money for expenses, which he calculated with care and she administered with rigor, but he listened with pleasure to any request she might make for unforeseen expenses. He never questioned a penny she spent. He never asked for any explanations, but she behaved as if she had to make an accounting before the tribunal of the Holy Office. He had never spoken to her about the nature or condition of his business, and he had never taken her to his offices in the port, which were in a location forbidden to decent young ladies, even if accompanied by their fathers. Lorenzo Daza did not come home before 10 o'clock at night, which was the curfew hour during the less critical periods of the wars. Until that time, he would stay at the parish cafe, playing one game or another, for he was an expert in all salon games and was a good teacher as well. He always came home sober, not disturbing his daughter, despite the fact that he had his first anisette when he woke and continued chewing the end of his unlit cigar and drinking at regular intervals throughout the day. One night, however, Vermina heard him come in. She heard his Cossack step in the stair, his heavy breathing in the second floor hallway, his pounding with the flat of his hand on the bedroom door. She opened it, and for the first time she was frightened by his twisted eye and the total slurring of his words. "We are ruined," he said. "Total ruin. So now you know." Bottom of 131. Why are they ruined? "That was all," he said, and he never said it again, and nothing happened to indicate whether he had told the truth. But after that night, Fermina Daza knew that she was alone in the world. She lived in a social limbo. Her former schoolmates were in a heaven that was closed to her. Above all, after the dishonor of her expulsion, and she was not a neighbor to her neighbors, because they had known her without a past. In the universe of the Academy of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin. Her father's world was one of traitors and stevedores, of war refugees in the public shelter of the parish cafe, of solitary men. In the last year, the painting classes had alleviated her seclusion somewhat, for the teacher preferred group classes and would bring the pupils to the sewing room, but they were girls of varying and undefined social circumstances, and for Fermina Daza, they were no more than borrowed friends whose affection ended with each class. Hildebrando wanted to open the house, air it, bring in her father's musicians and fireworks and castles of gunpowder, and have a carnival dance whose gale winds would clear out her cousin's moth-eaten spirit. But she soon realized that her proposals were to no avail, and for a very simple reason: there was no one to invite. In any case, it was she who thrust Fermina Daza into life. In the afternoon, after the painting classes, she allowed herself to be taken out to the city. Fermina Daza showed her the route she had taken every day with Aunt Scholastica, the bench in the park where Florentino Ariza pretended to read while he waited for her, the narrow streets along which he followed her, the hiding places for their letters, the sinister palace where the prison of the Holy Office had been located, later restored and converted into the Academy of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin, which she hated with all her soul. They climbed the hill of the pauper cemetery, where Florentino Ariza played the violin according to the direction of the winds, so that she could listen to him in bed, and from there they viewed the entire historic city, the broken roofs and the decaying walls, the rubble of fortresses among the brambles, the trail of the islands in the bay, the hovels of the poor around the swamps, the immense Caribbean. On Christmas Eve, they went to midnight mass in the cathedral. Fermina sat where she used to hear Florentino Ariza's confidential music with greatest clarity, and she showed her cousin the exact spot where, on a night like this, she had seen his frightened eyes up close for the first time. They ventured alone as far as the arcade of the scribes. They bought sweets. They were amused in the shop that sold fancy paper, and Fermina Daza showed her cousin the place where she suddenly discovered that her love was nothing more than an illusion. She herself had not realized that every step she took from her house to school, every spot in the city, every moment of her recent past, did not seem to exist except by the grace of Florentino Ariza. Hildebrand pointed this out to her, but she did not admit it, because she never would have admitted that Florentino Ariza, for better or for worse, was the only thing that had ever happened to her in her life. It was during this time that a Belgian photographer came to the city and set up his studio at the end of the Arcade of the Scribes, and all those with the money to pay took advantage of the opportunity to have their pictures taken. Fermina and Hildebrand were among the first. They emptied Fermina Sanchez's clothes closet. They shared the finest dresses, the parasols, the party shoes, the hats, and they dressed as mid-century ladies. Gala Placidia helped them lace up the corsets. She showed them how to move inside the wire frames of the hoop skirts, how to wear the gloves, how to button the high-heeled boots. Hildebrand preferred a broad-brimmed hat with ostrich feathers that hung down over her shoulder. Fermina wore a more recent model decorated with painted plaster fruit and crinoline flowers. At last they giggled, and they looked in the mirror and saw the resemblance to the daguerreotypes of their grandmothers, and they were off happy, laughing for all they were worth to have the photograph of their lives taken. Gala Placidia watched from the balcony as they crossed the park with their parasols open, tottering on their high heels and pushing against the hoop skirts with their bodies as if they were children's walkers, and she gave them her blessing so that God would help them in their portraits. There was a mob in front of the Belgian studio because photographs were being taken of Benny Seteno, who had won the boxing championship in Panama. He wore his boxing trunks and his boxing gloves and his crown, and it was not easy to photograph him because he had to hold a fighting stance for a whole minute and breathe as little as possible. But as soon as he put up his guard, his fans burst into cheers, and he could not resist the temptation to please them by showing off his skill. When it was the cousins' turn, the sky had clouded over and rain seemed imminent, but they allowed their faces to be powdered with starch, and they leaned against an alabaster column with such ease that they remained motionless for more time than seemed reasonable. It was an immortal portrait. When Hildebranda died on her ranch at Flores da Maria, she was almost 100 years old. They found her copy locked in the bedroom closet, hidden among the folds of the perfumed sheets, along with the fossil of a thought in a letter that had faded with time. For many years, Fermina Daza kept hers on the first page of a family album. Then it disappeared without anyone's knowing how or when, and came into the possession of Florentino Ariza through a series of unbelievable coincidences when they were both over 60 years old. When Fermina and Hildebranda came out of the Belgian studio, there were so many people in the plaza across from the Arcade of the Scribes that even the balconies were crowded. They had forgotten that their faces were white with starch, and that their lips were painted with a chocolate-colored salve, that their clothes were not appropriate to the time of the day or the age. The street greeted them with catcalls and mockery. They were cornered, trying to escape the public derision, when the landau drawn by the golden chestnuts opened a path through the crowd. The catcalls ceased, and the hostile groups dispersed. Hildebranda was never to forget her first sight of the man who appeared on the footboard. His satin top hat, his broad-catted vest, his knowing gestures, the sweetness in his eyes, the authority of his presence. Middle of 134. Although she had never seen him before, she recognized him immediately. The previous month, Fermina Daz had spoken about him in an offhand way and with no sign of interest. One afternoon, when she did not want to pass by the house of the Marquis de Casalduerdo, because the landau with the golden horses was stopped in front of the door, she told her who the owner was and attempted to explain the reasons for her antipathy, although she did not say a word about his courting her. Hildebranda thought no more of him, but when she identified him as a vision out of legend, standing in the carriage door with one foot on the ground and the other on the footboard, she could not understand her cousin's motive. "Please get in," said Dr. Juvenal Urbino. "I will take you wherever you want to go." Fermina Daza began a gesture of refusal, but Hildebranda had already accepted. Dr. Juvenal Urbino jumped down, and with his fingertips, almost without touching her, he helped her into the carriage. Fermina had no alternative but to climb in after her face blazing with embarrassment. The house was only 3 blocks away. The cousins did not realize that Dr. Urbino had given instructions to the coachman, but he must have done so, because it took the carriage almost half an hour to reach its destination. The girls were on the principal's seat, and he sat opposite them, facing the back of the carriage. Fermina turned her head toward the window and was lost in the void. Hildebranda, on the other hand, was delighted, and Dr. Urbino was even more delighted by her delight. As soon as the carriage began to move, he sensed the warm odor of the leather seats, the intimacy of the padded interior, and she said it seemed a nice place to spend the rest of one's life. Very soon they began to laugh, to exchange jokes as if they were old friends, and they began to match wits in a simple word game that consisted of placing a nonsensical syllable after every other syllable. They pretended that Fermina Daza did not understand them, although they knew that she not only understood, but was listening as well, which is why they did it. After much laughter, Hildebranda confessed that she could no longer endure the torture of her boots. "Nothing could be simpler," said Dr. Urbino. "Let us see who finishes first." He began to unlace his own boots, and Hildebranda accepted the challenge. It was not easy for her to do, because she stays in the corset because the stays in the corset did not allow her to bend, but Dr. Urbino dallied until she took her boots out from under her skirt with a triumphant laugh as if she had just fished them out of a pond. Then both of them looked at Fermina and saw her magnificent golden Oriole's profile sharper than ever against the blaze of the setting sun. She was furious for 3 reasons: because of the undeserved situation in which she found herself, because of Hildebrande's libertine behavior, and because she was certain that the carriage was driving in circles in order to postpone their arrival. But Hildebrande had lost all restraint. "Now I realize," she said, "that what bothered me was not my shoes, but this wire cage." Dr. Urbino understood that she was referring to her hoop skirt, and he seized the opportunity as it flew by. "Nothing could be simpler," he said. "Take it off." With the rapid movements of a prestidigate. Oh my goodness, this is a long word and it's cut up. With the rapid movements of a prestidigitator. How many syllables is that? You can count them. He removed his handkerchief from his pocket and covered his eyes with it. "I won't look," he said. The blindfold emphasized the purity of his lips, surrounded by his round black beard and his mustache with the waxed tips, and she felt herself shaken by a sudden purge of panic. She had looked at Fermina, and now she saw that she was not furious but terrified that she might be capable of taking off her skirt. Hildebrande became serious and asked her in sign language, "What shall we do?" Fermina answered in the same code that if they did not go straight home, she would throw herself out of the moving carriage. "I am waiting," said the doctor. "You can look now," said Hildebrande. When Dr. Juvenal Urbino removed the blindfold, he found her changed, and he understood that the game had ended, and not ended well. At a sign from him, the coachman turned the carriage around and drove into the park of the Evangels, just as the lamplighter was making his rounds. All the churches were ringing the Angelus. Hildebrande hurried out of the carriage, somewhat disturbed at the idea that she had offended her cousin, and she said goodbye to the doctor with a perfunctory handshake. Fermina did the same, but when she tried to withdraw her hand in its satin glove, Dr. Urbino squeezed her ring finger. "I'm waiting for your answer," he said. Then Fermina pulled harder, and her empty glove was left dangling in the doctor's hand, but she did not wait to retrieve it. She went to bed without eating. Hildebrande, as if nothing happened, came into the bedroom after supper with Galla Placidia in the kitchen, and with her inborn wit commented on the events of the afternoon. She did not attempt to hide her enthusiasm for Dr. Urbino for his elegance and charm, and Fermina refused to comment, but was brimming with anger. At one point, Hildebrande confessed that when Dr. Juvenal Urbino covered his eyes and she saw the splendor of his perfect teeth between his rosy lips, she had felt an irresistible desire to devour him with kisses. Fermina Daza turned to the wall, and with no wish to offend, but smiling with all her heart, put an end to the conversation. "What a whore you are," she said. Her sleep was restless. Dr. Juvenal Urbino everywhere. She saw him laughing, singing, emitting sulphurous sparks from between his teeth, with his eyes blindfolded, mocking her with a word game that had no fixed rules, driving up to the paupers' cemetery in a different carriage. She woke long before dawn and lay exhausted and wakeful, with her eyes closed, thinking of the countless years she still had to live. Later, while Hildebrande was bathing, she wrote a letter as quickly as possible, folded it as quickly as possible, put it in an envelope as quickly as possible, and before Hildebrande came out of the bathroom, she had Galla Placidia deliver it to Dr. Juvenal Urbino. It was one of her typical letters, not a syllable too many or too few, in which she told the doctor, yes, he could speak to her father. When Florentino Ariza learned that Fermina Daza was going to marry a physician with family and fortune, educated in Europe and with an extraordinary reputation for a man of his years, there was no power on earth that could raise him from his prostration. Transito Ariza did all she could and more, using all the stratagems of a sweetheart to console him when she realized that he had lost his speech and his appetite and was spending nights on end in constant weeping, and by the end of the week he was not eating again. Oh, poor guy. Then she spoke to Don Leo the 12th, Laoza, the only one of the 3 brothers who was still alive, and without telling them the reason, she pleaded with him to give to give his nephew any job at all in the navigation company as long as it was in a port lost in the jungle of the Magdalena. There was no where there was no mail, no telegraph, and no one who would tell him anything about this damnable city. His uncle did not give him the job out of deference to his brother's widow, for she could not bear the very existence of her husband's illegitimate son, but he did find employment as a telegraph operator in Via de Leyva, a dreamy city more than 20 days' journey away and almost 3,000 meters above the level of the Street of Windows. Bottom of 137. Florentino Ariza was never very conscious of that curative journey. He would remember it always as he remembered everything that happened during that period through the rarefied lenses of his misfortune. When he received the telegram informing him of his appointment, it did not even occur to him to consider it, but Lotario Thuget convinced him with his Germanic arguments that a brilliant career awaited him in public administration. He told him, "The telegraph is the profession of the future." He gave him a pair of gloves lined with rabbit fur, a hat worthy of the steppes, and an overcoat with a plush collar, tried and proven in the icy winters of Bavaria. Uncle Leo XII gave him 2 serge suits and a pair of waterproof boots that had belonged to his older brother, and he also gave him cabin passage on the next boat. Transito Ariza altered the clothing and made it smaller for her son, who was less corpulent than his father and much shorter than the German, and she bought him woolen socks and long underwear so that he would have everything he needed to resist the rigors of the mountain wastelands. Florentino Ariza, hardened by so much suffering, attended to the preparations for his journey as if he were a dead man attending to the preparations for his own funeral. Oh, this guy. The same iron hermeticism with which he had revealed to no one but his mother the secret of his repressed passion meant that he did not tell anyone that he was going away, and did not say goodbye to anyone. But on the eve of his departure, he committed with full awareness a final mad act of the heart that might well have cost him his life. At midnight, he put on his Sunday suit and went to stand alone under Fermina Dawes' balcony to play the love waltz he had composed for her, which was known only to 2 of them, and which for 3 years had been the emblem of their frustrated complicity. He played, murmuring the words, his violin bathed in tears, with an inspiration so intense that the first measures the dogs on the street and the dogs all over the city began to howl, and then little by little they were all quieted by the spell of the music, and the waltz ended in supernatural silence. The balcony did not open, and no one appeared on the street, not even the night watchman, who almost always came running with his oil lamp in an effort to profit in some small way from serenades. The act was an exorcism of relief for Florentino Ariza, for when he put the violin back into its case and walked down the dead streets without looking back, he no longer felt that he was leaving the next morning, but that he had gone away many years before with the irrevocable determination never to return. The boat, one of 3 identical vessels belonging to the River Company of the Caribbean, had been renamed in honor of the founder, Pius V Loyosa. It was a floating 2-story wooden house on a wide, level iron hull, and its maximum draft of 5 feet allowed it to negotiate the variable depths of the river. The older boats had been built in Cincinnati in mid-century on the legendary model of the vessels that traveled the Ohio and the Mississippi with a wheel on each side powered by a wood-fed boiler. Like them, the boats of the River Company of the Caribbean had a lower deck almost level with the water, with steam engines and the galleys and the sleeping quarters like hen houses, where the crew hung their hammocks crisscrossed at different heights. On the upper deck were the bridge, the cabins of the captain and his officers, and a recreation and dining room, where notable passengers were invited at least once to have dinner and play cards. On the middle deck were 6 first-class cabins on either side of the passage that served as a common dining room, and in the prow was a sitting room open to the river with carved wood railings and iron columns, where most of the passengers hung their hammocks at night. Unlike the older boats, these did not have paddle wheels at the sides. Instead, there was an enormous wheel with horizontal paddles at the stern just underneath the suffocating toilets on the passenger deck. Florentino Ariza had not taken the trouble to explore the boat when he came aboard on Sunday in July at 7 o'clock in the morning, as those traveling for the first time did almost by instinct. He became aware of this milieu only at dusk, as they were sailing past the hamlet of the Calamar, when he went to the stern to urinate and saw, through the opening in the toilet, the gigantic paddle wheel turning under his feet with a volcanic display of foam and steam. He had never traveled before. He had with him a tin trunk with his clothes for the mountain wastelands, the illustrated novels that he had bought in pamphlet form every month, and that he himself sewed into cardboard covers, and the books of love poetry that he recited from memory, and that were about to crumble into dust with so much reading. He had left behind his violin, for he identified it too closely with his misfortune, but his mother had obliged him to take his pitat, a very popular and practical bedroll, with its pillow sheet, small pewter chamber pot, and mosquito netting, all of this wrapped in straw matting tied with 2 hemp ropes for hanging a hammock in an emergency. Florentino Ariza had not wanted to take it, for he thought it would be useless in a cabin that provided bed and bedclothes, but from the very first night he had reason once again to be grateful for his mother's good sense. At the last moment, a passenger dressed in evening clothes boarded the boat. He had arrived early that morning on a ship from Europe, and was accompanied by the provincial governor himself. He wanted to continue his journey without delay, along with his wife and daughter, and livered servant and 7 trunks with gold fittings, which were almost too bulky for the stairway. To accommodate the unexpected travelers, the captain, a giant from Caracho, called on the passengers' indigenous sense of patriotism. In a jumble of Spanish and Caracho patois, he explained to Florentino Ariza that the man in evening dress was the new plenipotentiary from England, on his way to the capital of the Republic. He reminded him of how that kingdom had provided us with decisive resources in our struggle for independence from Spanish rule, and that as a consequence no sacrifice was too great if it will allow a family of such distinction to feel more at home in our country than in their own. Florentino Ariza, of course, gave up his cabin. At first, he did not regret it, for the river was high at the time of the year, and the boats navigated without any difficulty for the first 2 nights. After dinner at 5 o'clock, the crew distributed folding canvas cots to the passengers, and each person opened his bed wherever he could find room, arranged it with the bedclothes from his pitat, and set the mosquito netting over that. Those with hammocks hung them in the salon, and those who had nothing slept on the tables in the dining room, wrapped in the tablecloths that were not changed more than twice during the trip. Florentino Ariza was awake most of that night, thinking that he had heard the voice of Fermina Daza in the fresh river breeze, ministering to his solitude with her memory, hearing her sing in the respiration of the boat as it moved like a great animal through the darkness, until the first rosy streaks appeared on the horizon, and the new day... Man. So many breaks in my voice. Muscle spasm. Where was I? Gonna have to go back. First rosy streaks appeared on the horizon, and the new day suddenly broke over deserted pastoral land and misty swamps. Then his journey seemed yet another proof of his mother's wisdom, and he felt that he had the fortitude to endure forgetting. Bottom of 140. I'll go for like 2 or 3 more pages. After 3 days of favorable weather, however, it became more difficult to navigate between inopportune sandbanks and deceptive rapids. The river turned muddy and grew narrower and narrower in a tangled jungle of colossal trees where there was only an occasional straw hut next to the piles of wood for the ship's boilers. The screeching of the parrots and the chattering of the invisible monkeys seemed to intensify the midday heat. At night, it was necessary to anchor the boat in order to sleep. And then the simple fact of being alive became unendurable. To the heat and the mosquitoes was added the reek of strips of salted meat hung to dry on the railings. Most of the passengers, above all the Europeans, abandoned the pestilential stench of their cabins and spent the night walking the decks, brushing away all sorts of predatory creatures with the same towel they used to dry their incessant perspiration, and at dawn they were exhausted and swollen with bites. Moreover, another episode of intermittent civil war between liberals and conservatives had broken out that year, and the captain had taken very strict precautions to maintain internal order and protect the safety of the passengers. Trying to avoid misunderstandings and provocations, he prohibited the favorite pastime during river voyages in those days, which was to shoot the alligators sunning themselves on the broad sandy banks. Later on, when some of the passengers divided into two opposing camps during an argument, he confiscated everyone's weapons and gave his word of honor that they would be returned at the end of the journey. He was inflexible even with the British minister who, on the morning following their departure, appeared in a hunting outfit with a precision carbine and a double-barreled rifle for killing tigers. The restrictions became even more drastic above the port of Tenerife, where they passed a boat flying the yellow flag. The captain could not obtain any further information regarding that alarming sign because the other vessel did not respond to his signals. But the same day they encountered another boat with a cargo of cattle for Jamaica, and were informed that the vessel with the flag was carrying two people sick with cholera, and that the epidemic was wreaking havoc along the portion of the river they still had to travel. Then the passengers were prohibited from leaving the boat not only in the ports but even in the uninhabited places where they stopped to take on wood, so that until they reached the final port, a trip of 6 days, the passengers acquired the habits of prisoners, including the pernicious contemplation of a packet of pornographic Dutch postcards that circulated from hand to hand without anyone's knowing where it came from, although no veteran of the river was unaware that this was only a tiny sampling of the captain's legendary collection. But in the end, even that distraction with no explanation only increased the tedium. And I think that's where I'm going to stop. We are at the top, very, very top of 142.